Hi, I'm Michael Hershenson, President of the Queen Anne Historical Society. Welcome to Queen Anne Park. You are about to experience a great treat. Perched high above the Lake Washington Ship Canal on a hill whose steepness may explain its relatively late development, this 1920-1930 era tract is simply fun to visit. The lots and most of the houses in Queen Anne Park are relatively small. Yet whatever their official style, nearly all the pre-World War II homes sport little turrets, cute windows, and a surprisingly diminutive scale. This special look simply makes Queen Anne Park a joy. Knowing that nearly every house along its curving streets has phenomenal views through strategically placed windows gives Florence's tour an incredible charm. Understanding the history of the tract's owners and developers is an incredible plus, as is learning about the home that resulted from a design competition that was open only to women. Thanks to Florence for sharing her great knowledge of this special bit of Queen Anne, and thanks to you for going on this tour with her. And if you haven't already done it, for joining the Queen Anne Historical Society.
Good morning. Welcome to Queen Anne Park. Many people don't even know that Queen Anne Park exists. It's a wonderful neighborhood. The original land for this was 1871, and it was sold to James W. Law, L-A-W. So he bought that in 1871, and it changed hands a couple of times. In 1908, there was a gentleman named Thomas Prosh, and his father owned the Puget Sound newspaper, and the son joined his father there when he was 22. The son was 22, and then he bought it, and he moved the paper to Tacoma from Steilacoom, and then he moved it to Seattle. And then he sold it and became involved in other things. And he married someone whose parents were the founders of Tacoma, the McIvers. And he bought this whole area, and there is a map that you're going to see that shows where it was located and how there was nothing there in 1890. It will then show you a little bit about how that's changed and how he developed a plat for it, and it became Prosh's Queen Anne. And he offered the land that became Queen Anne Park to the state of Washington for a capital, and that was declined. And then he offered it to be a place for a sanatorium. TB was a really bad thing in that era. My grandmother, for example, died of it when my father was 2. So he offered it for a TB sanatorium, but the neighbors didn't like it. And, excuse me. So they took him to court, basically, and it was canceled then. So someone else named Mr. Henry bought the property out by, it's in North Seattle by Shoreline, and that became the Furland Sanatorium. So it's been other things. And then in September of 1909, it became Prosh's plat for Queen Anne. In 1909, there was property being sold all over the place. So he was very fortunate to have this. It didn't get built because he and his family were killed. They were killed in a car accident. In 1915, there were the Denny's. There were people from very famous Seattle families, and they all died. And the entire area sold, and it was purchased by a gentleman named George Morford. And he was married to the wife of Keene, and Keene was a philanthropist in Seattle, so he had money to work with and to build himself a nice house and so forth. He was an investment banker himself, and he was president of the Keene Company. And so this is Prosh neighborhood. It became part of the Queen Anne Park neighborhood, So we're going to now walk a little bit and go to another house. The first one we're going to stop and see is right here. It was a 1937 model home, and it had the first air conditioning of a house in Seattle. This is 3042 10th Avenue West, and this was the original office model home for the Queen Anne Park development, and this was built in about 1927. And I met the stepdaughter of the person who built this, who was the contractor in front of the entire subdivision, about 4 or 5 years ago. And she said there was no way this was going to be a gated golf course community. There was no way that it could be private or gated. One of the nice things about Queen Anne Park is that the streets were all put in before anything was built. And this was a hill, as is Queen Anne Hill. And so there were lots of ups and downs and so forth. So Mr. Morford, who was the one who bought the property, had a company called Morford and Mowry, and they wanted to make this a very pleasant area with curving streets as opposed to the ones that were squared off. And they wanted to put the houses so that most of them had views. Some of them on the back of this street could look east to the mountains, some of them to the University of Washington. On this side, or if people are lucky, they could see Puget Sound, Magnolia, and all of those sorts of things. So it was made to be a very lovely neighborhood. But all the streets were put in before anything was sold for housing. All the sewage systems, all the electricity, all of that was done ahead of time, so there was no need to cut up sidewalk or cut up for a driveway or do any of that. And so that was unusual. Another thing that was very unusual at that time is that all the power lines were put behind the houses. And you'll see as you walk down the streets that you don't have to look at telephone poles and the wiring, which is really very nice. If you're looking one direction and it goes to your backyard and then there are the mountains, yes, you would have to do that. But it makes the street and the neighborhood much prettier the way that they arranged to do it. So what happened after all of those things were put in, then they got really serious about it. And it seemed like almost every week there was an article in the Seattle Times telling what's going on in this neighborhood, showing pictures. There were pictures of this, and you'll see some of the original ones and some of the original newspaper articles about those things. They had a mill workshop on the property, and people bought a lot, and then they could have an architect design something for them, or they could buy one of the few homes that had already been built. So this was a lovely place. Unfortunately, something happened when the Great Depression happened. This was a builder-financed development, and so he owned all of these lots, but because of the Depression, he had to give a lot of them back to Mr. Keene and his company because he couldn't do it. But he did save this one for himself, and I have the deed that he signed buying it back from his corporation. And he did that in 1928. One thing that would be unusual in today's world is that there were covenants. Those were regulations that applied to anybody who bought property here, who built a house and so forth, and what they couldn't do. And in this neighborhood, it lasted essentially from 1928 to 1931. Whatever was built had to be a residence for one family. It couldn't be any closer than so many feet from the street, so that you could have a nice front yard or something like we're looking at here. It had to cost in those days at least $6,000, and depending on which year it was, that went up to $7,000 or $8,000. So it had to be quality. Then it says, number 3, no chickens, fowl, or other animals except for individual household pets. were allowed on the property. They could not be kept or maintained. So like we could have a dog, but we couldn't have any chickens. And there are people in our neighborhood today who do have chickens. And then another one, no person or persons of Asiatic, African, or Negro blood, lineage, or extraction shall be permitted to occupy a portion of the property or a building thereon, except domestic servant or servants may actually and in good faith be employed by white occupants. So in today's world, we have all sorts of people, people with different beliefs, with different races and so forth, and with different animals. So those lasted for about 3 years. And then it was like Madison Park, Capitol Hill, there were some of those places that still had them, even though they weren't official covenants. Some of the realtors were, and they shouldn't have been, discouraging people to buy certain pieces of property because they wouldn't be socially acceptable. So that was an issue that people had in those days. This house is especially special. Queen Anne, the contractor who was building these, the owner of the property, was a man way before his time, because he decided that it was important in building a house to build a house that best met the needs of the women of the day. Now, women, mind you, had just gotten the right to vote. So he and the Seattle Daily Times had a contest where women could submit designs for a house that would best meet their needs. So the house had to be at least 6 rooms. Now, mind you, in today's world, how could you survive in 6 rooms? But this was built. It had to have a garage. Either it could be separate and attached, or it could be underneath. And the original one was underneath the house. You went down the driveway and around and parked underneath it. The people who owned it last had a separate garage. But it's an incredible house. It has, it's been well remodeled, the basement's been fully finished and so forth. But it looked that way, and so they would have wonderful sunrises and moonrises and all of those sorts of things. So it's a very, very special place, but it was designed by a woman. There were over 300 women who entered this contest. And the woman who won lived in an apartment. And she won the prize. First prize was which was $100 in gold. And so she took her gold and she saved it, and she wanted at some point in her life, and I haven't researched that, so I don't know whatever happened to her, but she put it aside because she knew that at some point she wanted to have a house that would work with that. And so after she submitted her design, then it was taken by the builder here, by Grandy, and given to some architects to make sure that it was, would work with the square footage and da-da-da-da-da. And so this is what we had, and it sold in 10 days. And because of it, they built a third model home, and that was the Lehigh Cement one, and we're going to go there next. Okay, this was the third model home, the Lehigh Cement one, and it had an addition since that time on this side of the building. It must have been 20 years ago, probably. Anyway, it was very special, and it made it. But then there are other houses around here that weren't built yet, and weren't built for years because they were on vacant lots. Now we're at the corner of 8th Avenue West and West Dravis and Conkling Place. And if you recall, perhaps from earlier on, I mentioned that Conkling was named after Susan Conkling Prosh, the mother of Thomas Prosh, who did the first plat of this area. Okay, 8th Avenue West at one point had a house here that was red. It was a little old house, nothing overly special, and the owner wanted to get some money for his property, so he destroyed it. And I have a day-by-day, practically, photographs of him standing in front of his house when it started from the beginning until it was down to a pile of rubble. Okay, I mentioned earlier that There was someone named Harry Dubois, D-U-B-O-I-S, and he worked with Keene, who had the money, whose wife was married, or whose daughter was married to George Morford. And when things started falling apart, about 1931, he was given 2 lots that were right here as partial compensation for what they couldn't pay him. And there was a beautiful house with a lot here I would love to have had. And you'll get to see pictures of that. And then someone bought it a number of years ago, probably 20 years ago, and took it down, and the 2 new homes were built. About, I would guess, maybe 2006, somewhere around then. As I mentioned earlier, the Depression came along, and so there was a long period of time when there were empty lots, there were partially completed houses, and so forth. So it wasn't until the mid to late 1930s that people started building again. And so we have Ramblers and other styles intermixed with the Tudors and with the Spanish and the Italian houses and so forth that have been here. And so that's one of the reasons that Queen Anne Park is the way it is today, but it also makes it interesting because we're not all the same and we don't all have the same tastes. Okay, this is 3218 Conkling Place West, and I have an article from the Seattle Times from 1936 showing the house when it first went on the market, so it is not as old as some of the other ones. And it was white, and then now it's a pretty beige color. But something that wasn't there in the original picture that is very special is this catalpa, C-A-T-A-L-P-A, this catalpa tree that is a heritage tree. That means it's a very special tree for its particular variety in Seattle. I'm standing right now in front of a house on Conkling Place, and it has a house next to it as well that was designed by Fred Rogers, who did a number of beautiful Tudor houses in the Seattle area. And the current owner has done a lot to improve the neighborhood with the yard and so forth. And then the house next to it, which is where I used to live and spent 40 years, and how I became interested in what went on and how this neighborhood developed, was described as an artistic English Tudor. And so you'll see a picture of that, and Queen Anne will always be home to us. We don't live in the city anymore, but it's a beautiful neighborhood. There are fabulous neighbors, people of all interests, all races, all ages. I can't tell you, it's been a wonderful place to live. If you're curious about your house, the Queen Anne Historical Society is a great resource. They have meetings, they have fabulous articles that people are constantly writing about what has gone on here, whether it's who a builder was or what the streets were made of or anything of that sort. So if you're interested in finding out about your house, go for it because it can be done.